I want to thank you for joining me for another Todd Talk, where we take teaching theory and turn it into teaching practice. Today, what I'm going to be doing is introducing the idea of what are executive functioning skills and why we should teach these to our students. There will be a series of additional videos that covers each one of these skills and shows you what it might look like when you're putting it into practice. But for purposes of this video, I'm just going to go over the basics so that you have an understanding of exactly what are executive functioning skills. There are lots of things that could be termed executive functioning skills, but there are 10 that I'm going to focus on that are things that students can learn in the class. They're completely teachable. They can be taught, they can be learned, and students that tend to have these skills do better because they possess these skills. And these skills are planning, time management, metacognition, self-control, working memory, flexibility, attention, organization, task initiation, and perseverance. Now, as you can probably surmise for yourself, these 10 skills would be good for anyone to possess. But why we need to be more deliberate about teaching these is that some of our students do not have these skills, and yet we expect them to have them. So we give them a chunk of time, but we've never shown them how to manage that time. We ask them to, be willing to try again, and yet we've not taught them flexibility. We expect them to do things on their own, and yet we've never really asked or taught them how to do task initiation. So when you're looking at these skills, we want to look at ways that we can do these in the classroom. And so what I'm going to do is introduce each one of them to you. I'm going to talk about some strategies, some basic strategies that you might want to consider. And then I'm going to show you talk about what the enemy of these skills are when it comes to students and their thinking. Before we get to that point, I'd like to talk about the why. So why should you teach executive functioning skills? Why should you be deliberate about it? Why should you explicitly teach them? So I'm not going to talk about all of these. You can take a look at these. And almost all of the information I'm going to be sharing with you today came from the pathwaytosuccess.com, which is a wonderful site about executive functioning skills and how we can best teach them. But some of the ones I'm going to point out are executive functioning, they impact social skills. So students' ability to collaborate with others or to work with others or to work within a class setting. These social skills that we want all students to possess really stem from these executive functioning skills. So if you have these, then you'll be able to succeed socially. They're life skills. These are skills not just for the classroom. These are skills you'll be using your entire life. Think about all of these skills and how you use them in your current life as an adult, even not in the classroom. And so having these skills are going to benefit students in the long run. And it's important that you show them the relevance of this so that they understand the why. Why should they learn this skill? How will it help them down the road? We need to be really clear about that. What Hattie calls visible learning. We need to make sure they know the why. This also, in addition to supporting academics, also helps them with their SEL or their self-management, so their social-emotional learning. So having these executive functioning skills can help them to regulate themselves, not just academically, but just in general. And this helps with those social skills I talked about before. All right, so I'd like to talk about each of these, define what it is, give you some strategies, and then talk about what its enemy is. So the first one I'm going to talk about is planning. Planning is just as it sounds. This is a student's ability to have a well thought out strategy before they even begin a task. So imagine that you ask students to write an essay, and you want them to write a quality essay. Well, typically what happens is some students just start writing right away with no plan. And it really shows in the writing. They lack the structure or planning to be able to do that. And so, what if we created a space where students, the first thought that they have is to create a plan. So what would this look like? What steps should I take? What structure should I use? What outline should I follow? And so being able to plan things out just make them more quality products. Think about the building of a house. We just don't start building a house. We plan that out. What materials are we going to need? Where do they go? How will we accomplish that? All that stuff is planned out, because if you don't plan them out, then it's going to be a disaster, just like student work is going to be a disaster. So a few things that you might want to consider is teaching students to make to-do lists. Okay, so what do they need to do in order to do this assignment? What tasks need to be accomplished? What skills need to be learned? What needs to be accomplished? A calendar. I love using calendars in the classroom. I have a Todd Talk on using calendars to keep students focused. And using a calendar and having students figure out how to use this for themselves as a daily practice is a really good way to plan. So you can look at the big picture of things. You can look long term. I got a week worth that I need to work on this. How do I divide this stuff up and plan it out? And we'll talk about that in another skill we get into later. But using this calendar is going to help them to plan. I have a test on Friday. I look at my calendar. I have a soccer match on Thursday. So I need to study before that soccer match, because then I'll make sure I leave myself enough time to do that. And, so making sure that you're planning in that regard. Just the simple act of deciding what materials you need to bring to class. How many students come to your class without a pencil or something to write with? I mean, the most basic of tools. And they've not planned ahead. They're just not, they have 7 books in their book bag, but no pencil. And so they need to do a better job of planning what is needed for your typical class day. Now, sometimes there'll be special things that they'll need, and you'll need to make sure they know that. So if they need scissors a certain day, make sure you bring your scissors this day or whatever. But there are essential materials that students should bring to class all of the time. And so we need to be able to teach them what those look like. The enemy of planning is impetuousness. And what I mean by this is it is impetuous to just start something without a plan, to just say, okay, given a task, boom, I'm going at it. So if you've given me a math problem, I'm just going to start trying to solve it, rather than breaking it down, coming up with a plan to decide what math skills you're going to use in order to solve that. And so we want to make sure that students are not as impetuous. We want to make sure that they take a moment to pause, a moment to think about what they're doing. And this is what's going to help them with their planning. And this can then transfer to when it comes to when we talk about other issues, such as impulsivity issues. So if a student, how many times have you said to a student, or have you been told by someone, think before you talk? And so you want to take that pause. You want to make sure you plan things out. That doesn't have to be like extensive planning, but in some cases you do need to take some time to think before you act, before you speak, before you work. The second executive functioning skills I'd like to talk about is task initiation. This is a student's ability to start task and work on tasks without having to be told. That these are essentially independent workers. And I've seen this over the last few years with my own daughters, that my youngest daughter, a lot of times she can't do what she needs to do unless it's all been laid out for her. And why is this? Because her entire school career, it's all been laid out for her. So the teacher will say, here are the 5 things I need you to do. You're going to start here. You're going to do this, and do this. And when you finish this, you're going to do this, and so on and so forth. And so we kind of spoon feed students the tasks they're to do in our classroom. And so then when we give them something that is not so, is not so focused and that does not have those steps spelled out for them, they a lot of times struggle with that because then they're not sure how to do that without being told or being given direction or whatever. And so if we are going to improve task initiation, we need to make sure that we teach students certain things. One of these is don't wait to the last minute to do things. Procrastination, but a lot of times our classrooms teach this. For example, my older daughter, when she had an English paper due, she always waited till the last minute. It was due Sunday at midnight. She would start working on it Sunday at 11 p.m. And she would furiously type without much of a plan, without much of whatever. And every single time she got an A. And so what she was actually being taught is she can procrastinate. And we need to teach kids that you can't do that. Like giving them like project-based learning, I love to use, because you can't really, if you set the project up correctly, they can't do it at the last minute. Procrastination is really going to get them into trouble. Getting them in the habit of starting assignments right away. So so if you have to study for a test, don't wait till the last day to cram it all in. You could study a little bit every single day, and it's going to be so much easier, and it's going to be more meaningful, and you're going to have more enduring understanding than trying to cram it all in at the last second and then forgetting most of it after you take the assessment. It could be asking them in the classroom to take initiative to, pick up trash around them. Like we always tell kids, like, oh, pick up your stuff. And they're like, well, if it's not mine, I'm not picking it up. So teaching them, just the basic courtesy of, like, when there are things that need to be done, can you do them without being told? And so training them and to look for these things, to be aware of these things, will help them to take this initiative to complete things. The enemy of this one, which I kind of already talked about, is procrastination. And procrastination is something that a lot of people deal with, adults and children alike. There's a wonderful TED Talk by Tim Urban that you should check out. And he talks about the mind of the procrastinator. And the reality is that lots of people make this work for themselves, but it is not a healthy habit to get into. So I had a student that literally said to me, when she had the speech that she had been working on, we should have been working on for a month, and I said, "Did you start it yet?" And she goes, "No, but I work best under pressure." The reality is that she does not work best under pressure, but that's what how she's learned to work. In reality, if she had taken her time, done a little bit of this and that, she would produce much better work, 9 times out of 10. But we train ourselves that we can procrastinate and get away with it. So that's the enemy of task initiation. The third skill I want to talk about is organization. This is just being organized in general, having a system, keeping materials where you need them, planning accordingly. And so organization is something that can definitely be taught. So, for example, having a system to store your current homework assignments. So where do you put that? Do you put them in an agenda? Do you put them in a notebook? Do you put them on your phone? Do you have a system in place? My family makes fun of me because every time I come in from being out, I put my phone and my keys in the exact same place. And guess what? When I have to go find my keys and my phone, they're where I put them. So, and yet, my children and my wife will, like, where's my phone? I can't find my phone. They can never find their phone, or they can't find their keys because they don't put them in the same place. They don't have a system in place. Now, you don't have to have a system for every single thing, but having these systems helps you to be more organized. Another example is putting materials back in the correct spot. So if you do something, you use something, like if you use a tool, put that tool in the same place every time. Whenever I use my screwdrivers in my house, I put those screwdrivers back where they originally started. My wife will throw them in a drawer or put them on a counter or whatever. And then when we go to try to find them, we can't find them. And it may sound like my wife is extremely unorganized, but she's very organized, but some things that she's not. And so in some things I am, and where I'm not other cases. Keeping a neat and organized workspace is also important. The neat part is not as important as the organized. So sometimes you'll come to a student's desk and it looks like a bomb has gone off. But if you ask them to put hands on something, like, can you give me your math assignment? They can go find it. Can you find me this? And they can go find it. My desk is not really neat, but it's organized. I put things in the same place. I know where to find things, and I have a system that works for me. Neat is something that we a lot of times try to teach students because it makes it easier to find if you can see things, if it's not so cluttered. You do need to have it organized, but it doesn't necessarily have to be pristine and neat in order for that to be effective. The enemy of organization is messiness in general. So messiness of your thinking, messiness of your area, messiness, whereas it doesn't have a system. And so having that system in place allows things to be easily found. Even if it doesn't look neat, it still can be found. But if it's messy, you have things on top of one another, you have things, in places where they can't be seen, then you're going to overlook things. The next one I want to talk about is time management. And this is, again, something adults struggle with just as much as children. So this is the ability to use your time and use it efficiently. So if you're given a block of time, you're able to get accomplished what you need to get accomplished by the end of that. And so time management is really important in school because we often have deadlines. We have to have this in by this time, or this test is on this day or whatever. But are we teaching kids to look at the big picture and to look at, okay, how do I divide this up? This big picture, how do I chunk it? And that's one of the examples, is taking a project and chunking into smaller tasks. So I have this due on Friday. What do I need to accomplish on Monday? What do I need to accomplish on Tuesday? So on and so forth. A calendar is a great way to visually see this and what that looks like. Pacing yourself. So making sure that you understand something and then moving on to the next thing. Either quizzing yourself or looking for mastery is what we're really trying to do. So do I understand this before I go to this? And then once you do that, then you move on to the next task. Prioritization, which is really important. So when you have work to do, what do you do first? A lot of times we want to do what's fun first. We want to do the thing that's most exciting first. But we have to get certain work done. And so we have to prioritize. Look, I would love to watch YouTube videos on Brooklyn Nine-Nine, but I have this work to get done. So I need to prioritize what absolutely needs to be done. Sometimes I marvel at myself where I have a presentation the very next day, and yet I'm working on a presentation I'm not going to be doing for a month instead of focusing on the one I need to. And so we need to prioritize our tasks to make sure that we're starting with the important ones first, the ones that are most pressing, the ones that maybe have the soonest deadline are examples of ways to do that. The enemy of time management is focus. When we lose focus, we lose track of our time. So you can have a student that is so hyper-focused on something that they forget that they have all this other stuff to do or run out of time to do all this other stuff. It could be a lack of focus. So they're working on something, but they get distracted by something and they're doing this over here when they should be doing this over here. So having focus, too much focus, and having too little focus can both be enemies to this idea of task prioritization. We've got to make sure that we are kind of in that middle where we focus and we keep our eyes on the prize. And we can have ways to help us focus, like calendars and agendas and organizational tools such as that. The next one is working memory. This is being able to hold on to information that you need in order to apply it to a situation. So here are some examples of what this might look like. It's solving a mental math problem. So you're giving students a math problem that's not just like straightforward. They have to figure out what kind of math do I need to do here? What formula do I need to use? What a type of math do I need to apply here? And so word problems are a great way because they don't say you're going to be adding here, you're going to be subtracting, you're going to be multiplying. It just gives you a word problem. And then students have to kind of pull out the information that they need and then determine what skills they will need to use. Remembering instructions. So a teacher usually starts out a lesson with instructions, and hopefully they've written them down or made them available to you on a syllabus or whatever. But having the ability to remember what you were supposed to be doing is going to be really important. So you can be like, what was I supposed to do? What were we supposed to be working on? I can't tell you how many students of mine, will get to the end of a work day and they're like, okay, I didn't do what I was supposed to do, but I kind of forgot what the instructions were or forgot what I was doing. This also comes in your social skills, thinking about what someone is saying in a conversation. And rather than being really ready to pounce on that and just give your thoughts, listen to what they have to say, take it into your memory, and then you reply that to something, a point that you want to make or whatever. Now, the enemy of working memory actually is memorization. And I know this seems contrary to what it's said, but there's a difference between memorizing and understanding, a huge difference. I can memorize my multiplication tables, but do I understand how multiplication works? I can memorize how to spell something, but do I understand how spelling works? I'm always amazed when we do our spelling bees and there's a list to study from. Students can get through all of those words without any problem if they've studied. But when we get off book, when we start using words that were not in the study guide, and they have to use the principles of spelling and using prefixes, suffixes, root words, whatever, they don't necessarily understand how to do that. And as soon as we go off the list, usually a lot of kids drop out because they don't understand how to spell. They've memorized how to spell. And so understanding is going to be really important when it comes to working memory. Metacognition. And this is just being aware of your own strengths and weaknesses, and being able to work with your strengths and to recognize where your weaknesses are and then come up with ways to cope with that or to work around. I'll give you a great example. I can be very forgetful. So I have two strategies that I use because I'm aware of this weakness. When my wife asks me to do something, I do it almost immediately. She'll say, you don't need to do it now, but, and I'll say, nope, I'm doing it right now, because if I don't do it right now, I'll forget. Another strategy I use is if my wife asks me to do something, but I can't do it right then, I write it down on a Post-it note or on a notepad or somewhere. I write it to remind me of what I need to do. Because for me, it's very much out of sight, out of mind. So I realize this is a weakness of mine. Also, recognizing your strengths is important, knowing what you're good at and being able to offer that. I call this the American Idol syndrome. American Idol is a reality show where people come in and they sing, and then they get chosen to move on to without music, and they get chosen to move on to different things. And you always have these people that come in the initial rounds and they are horrendous singers. They lack any awareness that they're a terrible singer. And it just takes a second to listen to them to realize that. And so they don't recognize their weakness. And so they can't really work on their strengths. And so we want to make sure that kids are more aware of their strengths, more aware of their weaknesses, use their strengths to their advantage, kind of figure out ways to work with their weaknesses. Doesn't mean we have to make their weaknesses strengths. Some weaknesses are just going to be weaknesses. But how can we work around that? And so some examples that you can use are thinking about a topic before learning new information. So really thinking about it. So that planning part I talked about, we should not be impetuous and just right away start doing something. We should think. And as teachers, we can do this with reflections. We can do this with pre-assessments. We can get this with discussions and conversations to get them thinking, to get them curious before they learn this new information. Deciding what material you need to study for a test or quiz. We tell our students all the time, study for the test. But do we show them how to study? Do we say, this is what this might look like? This is how you review. A lot of times we go to the note cards, but that is a memorization tool where you have these note cards and you have them written on there and you're memorizing it and you're recalling them. But are you understanding them? And then just make sure you check in on how you are doing while completing assignments. So this is the idea of a reflection. At the end, when you have finished, what did you learn? What did you learn that worked? What did you learn that didn't work? And as teachers, we can have students purposefully reflect at the end of every lesson. It could be as simple as an exit ticket. It could be, something more structured. But we need to have students reflect, because this is what allows us to identify our strengths and recognize our weaknesses. So if we say, I'm a great leader, and then you reflect back upon it and your group was in disarray the entire time and you were arguing with someone the entire time, maybe that's not a strength. Maybe that's something that needs to be worked on. Maybe there's things that you could do to improve that. The weakness, kind of the enemy of metacognition is hubris. So not being willing to say, I'm not as great at this as I think I am. Maybe I should listen to someone who is, or maybe I should figure out ways to make myself better. Hubris is just that cockiness that we know things that we don't necessarily know. And with gifted students especially, some students possess this hubris where they think they know everything, which is impossible. So we need to recognize that we don't know everything, and that we can rely on others or rely on skills to help us to learn that, rather than just knowing it all the time. Another executive functioning skill is self-control. This is being able to regulate your thoughts, your actions, your emotions. And so you see that some of these executive functioning skills, a lot of them overlap with one another. So some examples of what you can do is stopping and thinking before you make a choice. So if I'm going to do something, did I even give it a moment's thought before I acted? Because a lot of times when we act without thinking, it does not work out well. And so we need to stop and think. So that's that planning part. That's that task initiation. That is that prioritization. That is all those things kind of coming into play. But then when it comes to your social emotional, completing a task that needs to be done, even if it's not the most favorite item that you want to do. We talked about this with task prioritization. Don't pick the thing that's most fun first. Pick the thing that needs to be done, because otherwise, what happens is you do the fun thing, you get caught up in the fun thing, and you never get around to doing the thing that actually needed to be done. So you got to make sure that you complete those tasks and prioritize accordingly. Using strategies to calm down when you are dealing with overwhelming emotions. Gifted students have some gifted students have what are called overexcitabilities, and so learning how to regulate that. If you become angry, what can you do to help with that? If you become overwhelmed, what are strategies that you might consider? And we can teach students these strategies. They don't have to figure these out for themselves. We can teach them. We can give them a toolbox of strategies that they can use, and then students can figure out which one works best for them and then use those. The enemy of this is impulsivity. And so what I mean by this is that student that shouts out answers as soon as you ask the question. And so there are things that we can do in the classroom. And so I have what is called wait time. So I'll ask students a question and I'll say to them, I'm not going to call on anyone for the first 2 minutes. I just want you to use this time to think about this. And here's my recommendation. Don't go with the first thing that comes to mind. Think of what's your second, what's your third, what's your fourth. Well, we can structure this and model this in the classroom to teach this skill so that students are not so impulsive, where they take a moment to think, they pause, which can be really, really important. The next executive functioning skill is attention. And this is also focus. So can students focus not just on something, but for sustained periods of time? Now, you have your ADHD students who have difficult focusing, but there are times they can focus when they really are motivated. So, for example, they can play a video game for 3 hours and focus on that game. But then you ask them to do something that maybe is not so exciting to them or not so motivating, and they get distracted. And this happens not just with ADHD kids, with everyone. And so some things you can do is to try to avoid distractions. So when I know I have to get some work done, I try to find a quiet place where I can close my door to get that work done, because I know otherwise I'm going to be distracted by things. So COVID was really interesting because I had to work at home a lot. And so there were other people at home. And so I learned, I had an office in the basement so I could get away from that and get away from distractions. Okay. And another thing is like having the television on when you're studying, or having your phone with you when you're trying to do work and always looking at it. We need to remove these distractions as best we can. When a teacher is talking with you or trying to teach you something, thinking about what is said. So the research has shown you can really only pay attention really intently for about 10 minutes, unless something new triggers you, another hook comes into play and it gets you. So there are teachers that may lecture for an hour. If you're not careful as a teacher and you don't have those hooks every 10 minutes or so, students are going to really have trouble paying attention. Even those that want to, even those that are compliant, are going to have trouble. So hopefully, because I've been talking for over 10 minutes through this video, I've had hooks that have engaged you, whether it's the visuals, whether it's the examples I give, whether it's the changing of slides. We also need to figure out ways to use strategies to refocus ourselves when we lack focus. So recognizing, this is again to recognize those strengths and weaknesses. When we recognize, I get distracted a lot, I get distracted very easily, or I'm off task, or like I'll go into my phone to do something, a very specific task, and I get distracted because there's a message here and there's an app here or whatever. And after 10 minutes of playing with all this, I'm like, what did I get on the phone originally to do? And so need to make sure that I have strategies that allow me to refocus and think about what I'm doing. So for that student that wants to impulsively ask a question, but you're asking them to hold off on their question, teaching them to write that question down so that they can, because otherwise it's going to stick in their head. They're not going to be able to focus on anything else. But when they write it down, and then they can let go and they can focus again on what they need to focus and then come back to the question. I like to use parking lots in my classroom where students can take questions they have and write on a Post-it note and put it in the parking lot that we can address later. The enemy of this is shiny things. Now I say this a little, facetiously, but it is, there are things that distract people, whether it's the internet, whether it's their phones, whether it's their, whatever. We have a lot of distractions. Students have more distractions nowadays than they have ever had. So learning how to minimize those distractions, but more importantly, how for them to teach that to themselves. So for example, if we say there are no cell phones in the classroom, that just makes them want to get on their cell phones even more. So instead, what if we teach them how to, you're going to use your cell phone, but only for this, and we give them some ideas on how to best use those things that they have so they don't become a distraction. Flexibility is our next one, and this is the ability to adapt to something. And in life in general, this is a very important skill to have because life does not happen according to plan. John Lennon once famously said, "Life is what happens when you're making other plans." So you have your plan, but you always are going to go to plan B, plan C, plan D. Rarely does it work out like you intend it to. And so we need to be flexible. So some examples of things we can do is going with the flow. When things don't go your way, letting go and moving on with that. I see this in group work a lot where and I always try to teach students, there's a difference between not being listened to and not getting your way. Those are two very different things. They may have listened to you, but they may not have agreed with what you suggested, so they didn't do what you said. That's very different than some students don't feel listened to, and that is the case. Sometimes they're not listened to. And so it's important that they express that to their group, that they didn't feel they got to be heard before they were turned down. Being able to problem solve in a new way. This is the whole idea of grit. This is the idea of being able to push through when something doesn't go your way. When you hit an obstacle, how can you go around that? Can you go over that? Can you go under it? Can you go through it? How can you best do that? What are strategies and coping mechanisms that you develop to do these things? And then perspective taking. And so we need to be able to see different point of views. So if you're in a group and you're working and someone thinks this and you disagree with them, can you try to understand their point of view? You don't have to agree with it, but can you understand it and see where they're coming from? And this is then works on those social skills. It makes you more, empathetic to people. And so we need to make sure that we're being flexible by looking at other people's point of views. And we can do this in our lessons. When I taught social studies, I always tried to look at one piece of history from multiple perspectives so they could see where people were coming from. So it wasn't like the good versus the bad. It was this versus this thinking, and what was that thinking? The enemy of flexibility is stubbornness. So if you are a stubborn person and you don't get your way and you're not willing to move on, or you're not willing to listen to others, it's going to be very difficult to be flexible. As teachers, we need to learn to be flexible all the time. I mean, if one thing I've really learned from being a teacher is that to be flexible, go with the flow. When things don't go according to plan, it's perfectly okay. Because it rarely goes according to plan. Technology is a perfect example of this. Technology rarely works like we want it to work. And so we have to learn to be flexible with that and figure out ways around that. So we need to not be stubborn. We need to be open-minded with that. The last one I'm going to talk about is perseverance. And this is sticking with something, even when it gets challenging. I already referenced grit very briefly, but this ability to have grit means that you're going to stick to it. You're going to keep doing it even when it becomes difficult. And this can be really challenging with gifted students because a lot of times things have come very easy to them because of their high abilities. But eventually it catches up with you. Eventually, sometime, it's going to catch up with you and things are going to become difficult. So the question that you have to ask is, do you have the ability then to, now that things are difficult, to persevere? Or is it like, oh, it's not coming to me easy, it's not coming, now I'm just going to give up? So what I tend to see is that there are the kids that struggle early in their school career, maybe because things don't come as easy to them, usually have more perseverance than those that things came easy to, because those students have been spending their entire schooling career developing this perseverance. And yet the student who all of a sudden is met with a challenge has not developed those skills. So we as teachers need to help them develop those skills. How can we do those things? And so some things we might do is using strategies to keep them working through the task. I had a friend that talked to me the other day, and he was like, I'm struggling with writing. I'm getting stuck. And so my suggestion to him was just to push through, write anyway. Even if you know it's going to be terrible, push through, write it, and then you can go back and you can fix that writing. And so being, not giving up, not stopping, continuing on, even when, but having a plan, not just do it impetuously, but having a plan for, I'm going to move forward and do this, and then I'm going to come back and fix it later. Using positive self-talk, mindset is a great way to think about things. So the way we say things is really important. So instead of saying, I can't do this, instead saying, I see this as a challenge. And so sometimes we get things in our head that we can't do. And it's not that we can't do that, but we definitely think we can't do it. I think I can't do foreign language, but I know that if I was forced to do it, or you put me in a foreign country where people didn't speak English and I was forced to do it, I could learn how to do it. I could adapt. But I have it in my head I can't do it. So when I take foreign language classes, I really struggle with that. Having the willingness to ask for help. It's not a sign of weakness when you ask for help. It is a sign of you understanding that I need some support here. And it's really important to use that support. That's what teachers are here to do, is to offer support to students. Not giving them the answer all the time. I try not to give them the answer. I try not to get them unstuck. I want them to learn how to do that themselves, but I'll maybe guide them or give them a suggestion. So if we just simply answer the questions of our students, we are not teaching them perseverance. We're giving them the answers and they become dependent upon us for those answers. We need to teach them to depend upon themselves to overcome this. The enemy of perseverance is fear. So when we're afraid to make mistakes, when we're afraid to take a chance, when we're afraid to take a risk or to go big, that prevents us from moving on. And so we have to be willing to put aside this fear. So getting up to publicly speak can be really intimidating and really scary. But once you recognize this fear and you push through anyways, you become more confident each time you do this. And I've seen this with students. I teach public speaking courses, and over the 16 weeks, they go from someone who can't put two words together to someone that can give a 20-minute speech, because they've overcome this fear. They've not gotten rid of the fear. The anxiety, the worry is still there, but they've learned how to deal with it. And that's the important aspect there. So just some general strategies you might think about. And I'm not going to go through all of these, but you can look through these. So having things written down on the classroom is really helpful for people who need to learn planning skills. But not saying to them, you need to take out your agenda, you need to open to this thing. We teach that to the younger kids, but we need to eventually wean them off of that and get them used to the idea of a habit of just writing things down. You might want to have a check-in with students at the end of the day, whether it's a checklist to remember what they need to take home, to what homework they need to do, to what they need to study for. Giving brain breaks is really important. Students have to sit for 6 to 8 hours a day in a classroom. And that can be real. I have trouble sitting through 45-minute meetings sometimes. And so imagine a student sitting, even if they're moving classrooms or whatever, they're sitting a lot. And so we need to give them a brain break every once in a while, whether it's allowing them to work on something that's kind of fun, or to have them, do something that's not what's part of what your curriculum is, but having them just take a break, just having them relax, stand up and stretch, things like that. Another strategy is that we want to make sure that we create routines and allow students to practice these routines. So again, learning what to do and what works for you is going to be really important to be able to do that. It's going to help you be more organized. It's going to help you be more aware. It's going to help you with a lot of these executive functioning skills. So in a nutshell, those are executive functioning skills. Again, these work for all students and all adults. having these is going to be really helpful. It can be especially helpful for twice exceptional students. Twice exceptional students are those that are gifted and have a learning disability. So how can we support the gift by, helping them with the disability? And so helping them learn some of these executive functioning skills can be really helpful to then have them use their ability to shine. And this goes for every student, not just ones that have disabilities, but any student that gets distracted or doesn't initiate tasks or doesn't prioritize and do all of these things. We have those highly gifted students in our classroom that sit there and don't seem motivated. But the reality is that maybe they've never been taught how to be motivated, how to initiate tasks, how to do those things. We can't just expect them to do these. We need to be deliberate about teaching them, and that way they can learn them, because these are learned skills. You're not born with these skills. They're learned somewhere. And so you have to ask yourself, how are you helping support this learning in your classroom?